So Democratic leadership told us that Joe Biden was fine, mentally, physically. And they told us that 1,000 times. They were lying. It was obvious that he was not fine.
Cenk Uygur was a guest on Piers Morgan's show, Piers Morgan Uncensored, to go up against a panel that included Natalie winners. And the topic of discussion was the so-called cover-up of Joe Biden's health while he was president of the United States. We're going to take a look at these clips of Cenk Uygur on Piers Morgan's show. I'm going to share my thoughts on this as well. Let's get into it together.
Well, joining me now, James Rubin, the former US diplomat and co-host of The X-Files with Christiane Amanpour, which launched last Tuesday. Cenk Uygur, founder and host of The Young Turks. Doran Spielman, the IDF reservist and author of the new book, When the Stones Speak. Scott Horton, host of The Scott Horton Show and author of Provoked. And Natalie Winters, the co-host of Bannon's War Room. Well, thank you all for joining me. I think there are several aspects of this extraordinary revelation about Joe Biden's health. But the most pertinent, it seems to me, is a lot of oncologists, like Ezekiel Emanuel, have come out and said it is simply impossible for this not to have been detected a lot earlier than not just last week, but years ago. And especially if you're the President of the United States and you're having medicals all the time. Has there been, do you think, a massive cover-up here? Or is this conspiracy theory mayhem running riot?
I haven't the faintest idea. I'm not a doctor. I really wouldn't know. What I do know, and what I think is getting lost in this discussion, is that as a mistake as it was to run for re-election, as he did for several months and then stood down, President Biden had a good presidency, and our country was better off for it. And all this discussion of performativeness about communications and was he an older man and this and that, he made good decisions. He made good judgments. The United States and the West were better off because he decided to stand up to Vladimir Putin after his invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think there's any other Democrat who would have done what Joe Biden did, which is stand up to Putin, gather world leaders together, and really put the pressure on in defense of Ukraine. Whether the Trump would have, I think, is doubtful. And I suspect that some of the other Democrats, as Barack Obama was in 2014, would have been reluctant to stand up to Vladimir Putin. So the big issue of our time is not what did or didn't happen during the oncology exams. It's whether we're going to stand up to face a Russia that is militarized, that is supported by the world's largest military buildup in the world in China. And is the West going to respond to that? And these are the issues that I focus on. I don't really know.
But aren't the two, I mean, look, yeah, but James, aren't the two inexorably interlinked in the sense that the person charged with making potentially enormous decisions in how you combat somebody like Vladimir Putin, potentially even down to considering the deployment of nuclear weapons, that person, it was pretty obvious for the last 2 years of his presidency, his cognitive decline was rapid, his physical decline was rapid. And this new book by Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, which is a #1 bestseller now, but this new book, it carries just endless revelations, very well-sourced revelations, that Biden simply wasn't fit for office in that last period of his presidency. So I don't disagree with you that the situation with Putin was an enormously important thing, or that Biden went some way to trying to tackle him in Ukraine. Where I dispute is the fact that it's sort of either or. To me, if the President of the United States is not fit for office and he has to deal with someone like Vladimir Putin, that's an incredibly dangerous situation for the United States and the world. Do you accept that?
Not in the least. Joe Biden was president for 4 years. I worked very, very closely with him as a young man, and I didn't work with him as president. But Tony Blinken, who was the Secretary of State, did. I spoke to him yesterday about this, knowing these kind of questions are coming out. And it was his observation that when it came to decisions about war and peace, nuclear threats or no nuclear threats, gathering together the West, dealing with Netanyahu's government, dealing with the Chinese, that he never observed a failure of judgment on the part of the president. Was he performatively always perfect? Clearly not. He made that decision for himself that he couldn't run for another term. But to jump to that and say because he might have had a prostate cancer diagnosis, he wasn't fit to be president is a real big leap for me. I believe President Biden made very good decisions in foreign affairs where I know something about it, where I observed the decisions, where I've been in this business for 35 years. And I know how hard it is for presidents to make decisions, to both confront Putin, but avoid the risk of nuclear war. President Trump is obsessed with the risk of nuclear war. If you ask him what pissed him off about Zelensky in the White House office was when Zelensky suggested there were risks to the United States. So Joe Biden stood up to Vladimir Putin, gathered the West, confronted Russia, and avoided the risk of world war using the subtlety and decision-making that he had as president. And his Secretary of State has testified to me, and I believe him, this is an honest man, that he never observed in the conduct of foreign affairs. In the conduct of foreign affairs, he never observed the decision-making cognitive failures that are being attributed to Joe Biden because he had a bad debate night, or was an old man who occasionally did forget names, who occasionally had a bad memory. But when he was confronted with crises, remember, adrenaline flows when you're confronted with a crisis. We all know that, Piers. You know that perfectly well.
Well, yeah, you do.
Can be
but
very
honestly,
tired and old, but adrenaline flows when
Yeah.
you're president, and you make good decisions. And I've had that testified to me by Secretary Blinken, and I trust him.
Okay, Cenk Uygur. So look, we've got it all wrong. When it came to the big decisions, Biden was spot on. I don't really accept the adrenaline thing simply because the President of the United States shouldn't need an adrenaline rush to make good decisions, would be my observation, James. But I hear you. You've spoken to well-sourced people, high level, and some of them have been out there saying, you know what, he was fine when it came to big decisions. Cenk, your response to this, and I guess the big question is going to be, if these oncologists are correct in what they're saying, that he must have had this for several years at least to have progressed to the stage where it metastasized to his bones, then was there a cover-up? And is the cognitive issue we're talking about actually connected to the fact that all this time he's had aggressive cancer?
Yeah, so let's establish things that make sense. So first of all, now at this point, President Biden has a very serious form of cancer. So my heart goes out to him and his family. And this isn't personal. But at the same time, we have to be honest about what got us into this mess. Because it isn't about Biden. It's about, do you just bow your head to power and the demands of power, including the gaslighting and the absurdity? So Democratic leadership told us that Joe Biden was fine, mentally, physically. And they told us that 1,000 times. They were lying. It was obvious that he was not fine. I don't need to be a doctor. I didn't need to be an insider that was with him 24 hours a day. We all saw it in public appearances. It was super obvious. He would shake hands with invisible people. This is not a close case. He would mumble. He would say things like, we defeated Medicare. Come on. So now I'm supposed to sit here and listen to this absurdity about how he was such a great decision maker when the adrenaline was flowing through him. Adrenaline can lead to bad decisions, and this is just preposterous all around. So did they know that he had this type of cancer? Well, there's only two possible answers. One is Biden said, don't test me. And maybe because he was worried that they would come up with things that would show that he shouldn't be president. And he had, let's be honest, infinite greed, infinite ego. You said no other Democrat could have rallied our allies to oppose Russia when they invaded Ukraine. Why? Are all the other Democrats in the country pathetic? This kind of hero worship is absurd. No, many other Democrats would have done the same thing that Joe Biden did, and I would argue a lot better because they were in much better mental shape.
Much of what Cenk Uygur is saying here, I agree with, as well as Piers Morgan. This idea about the adrenaline is just ridiculous. This makes no sense. But I think the key here is when Cenk Uygur said this is not about Joe Biden. And I'm going to present this in a little bit different way than what he stated there. MAGA and all the Republicans are making this just about Joe Biden, and Joe Biden, in their mind was evil and there was this cover up and all this kind of stuff. And maybe all of that is true. That's more and more is going to come out about this. But the real problem with all of this is a system where we have presidents in their 70s and 80s, and we have members of Congress in their 70s and 80s. The real conversation needs to be had about an age limit. we have a minimum age to be president of the United States of 35 years old. We need a maximum age of 65 to run for president. We also need a maximum age of 65 to run to be a member of Congress. We've seen this just in the last year or so. Mitch McConnell, Dianne Feinstein, obviously the issues with Joe Biden. And this isn't an age issue, but we've seen the issues with John Fetterman. So we need mechanisms in place where there's some kind of an independent board of something that looks at the members of Congress and presidents. They have a full physical and a mental evaluation every year. And then if something is really tipped off that is serious, then there can be some mechanism in place to say, hey, is this person still able to do the job from a cognitive and physical standpoint? One of the things that was absolutely absurd during this last presidential campaign is we had the disastrous debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And after all the media came out and all of a sudden was like, oh my God, did you know that Joe Biden is old? As if nobody had noticed this before. And then when there were all these calls for Joe Biden to step down, everything coming from the White House and everything was being reported as, well, the president and the first lady are going to talk this over and decide whether they want to continue forward. It's their decision. That's absolutely insane. It should not be their decision. Imagine your work, the place where you work. If you had somebody in their 80s working there and they were showing clear signs of cognitive decline and making mistakes and calling people the wrong names and all of this, and everybody at your company is saying, hey, Joe, you've had a nice run, but now it's time to go and hang it up and spend time with your grandkids. But the management is saying, well, we got to let Joe and his wife talk it over to decide whether or not they want to continue working here. I mean, imagine how ludicrous that would be. And these are people that are supposedly working for us, the American people, but they get to make the decision whether they stay in there or not. It's insane. So to me, the conversation here is not specifically about Joe Biden, but a system where we have people in there who are too old, and there needs to be some kind of mechanism that is not their political party deciding it. It's not them and their family deciding whether they're going to stay in there. But again, I think you eliminate a lot of this with a cutoff age of 65 or at least 70. But does anybody really think that, and people say, well, so-and-so is really sharp at whatever age. Okay, but we need a system in place to keep this from happening.
So if we actually challenged our own, we would get better leaders. We would get stronger leaders who could defeat people like Donald Trump, who has an IQ of around 70. If you can't manage to beat Donald Trump, and it isn't about Biden, there's the same Democratic leadership, the same liars in mainstream media told you that Hillary Clinton couldn't lose, that you shouldn't go with a progressive, you shouldn't go with a populist, you shouldn't go with an outsider, you should go with the insider establishment guys that know everything. And they know Hillary's going to win. They know Kamala's going to win. They know Joe Biden is the best Democrat. Nonsense. We lifted the curtain, we saw the all-powerful wizard, and we know that the wizard is full of crap. So please spare us this apologist nonsense for the great man of Joe Biden. No, he's a normal, egotistical politician. The second possibility is, yes, they tested him, and yes, they hid it. Would that really be surprising, given that how much the Biden administration hid his mental decline? If they hid his physical decline, of course that wouldn't be surprising. Let's stop pretending to be shocked by it.
Okay, Natalie.
Piers, if you'd give me a chance, he just disagreed pretty strongly with something, and I really think that he needs to study foreign policy more carefully. I don't remember my colleague's name.
Oh, yeah, I know.
I study foreign policy for a living, and I know the positions of all the various Democrats, and I've watched over 20 years how Democrats respond to Vladimir Putin. The last Democratic president, President Obama, didn't respond to the war in Ukraine, and Joe Biden was advocating for it privately. There are many Democrats who didn't see this as a big an issue as Joe Biden did. We can, all the rest of the stuff is about politics and establishment and anti-establishment stuff. I don't know about any of that. What I know is the foreign policy business, and I can say with confidence that of the various leaders of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden was the one most likely to respond in the most aggressive way to Vladimir Putin's invasion. I say that with great confidence, despite what your colleague suggested.
Okay. Natalie, just before I get your general response to this story, I've been really shocked. I went on X last night because within minutes of me posting the news with the statement from the Biden family, which was, indisputable in what it said. This was stage 5, very aggressive prostate cancer that had metastasized into his bones. If you're in your 80s and that has happened to you, you are fighting for your life. And, it doesn't need an expert to tell you you're in very serious danger of losing your life. And in that moment, it just seemed to me the only humane response is to wish him well. You can have all your other debates and arguments, over the next few days, as people have been doing the last few months. That's fine. But at least give the man, 24 hours of decency and humanity, as I would expect if it was Donald Trump or if it was anybody else. But I was struck by the venom that poured out. And I then posted again, said, look, whatever your politics here, come on. This is sick. What is going on? Just show some respect to this guy. 50 years of public service, fighting for his life. But no, that just made it worse. There was a tidal wave of filth on social media. Mockery, glee, ecstasy, willing him to die quickly. Not a shred of humanity pervading so much of what I saw. And I wasn't just disappointed or angry about it. I was genuinely shocked. How has it come to this? How has our society come to this place where partisan politics is so tribal, so bitter, so uncompromising that actually even when a man in his 80s is fighting for his life from a deadly cancer, that is a moment to mock him and be gleeful and hope he dies?
Yeah, it's gross. I mean, I obviously condemn that. I'm sure everyone on the panel agrees with me, but I think let's not be myopic. I think we see it certainly on both sides, right? I think with President Trump's 2 assassination attempts, you have Comey posting the 86-47 stones. It's a broader cultural shift. But of course. But I think that's sort of tangential to the issue, or a separate thing. I think the anger that is sort of seeding that is an outrage for, respectfully, people who will come on this program. I would say that you should maybe study the prerequisites to be commander-in-chief or the president of the United States. I think it's more than just a surge of adrenaline that maybe gives you a 50% chance to maybe make a good decision. I'd also posit that maybe certain other presidential candidates, whether President Trump or Democrats, wouldn't have actually had to have stood up to Putin because he wouldn't have invaded like he didn't under President Trump, because they wouldn't have had someone who was essentially dead, either from a mental cognizance perspective or even just an actual health standard. And I think if you look at the legacy of the Biden regime, it's cover up after cover up after cover up. And I'm so glad that Antony Blinken is very adamant that Joe Biden had a really good sense of geopolitics. I really disagree with that. I think that's just a continuation of this cover-up. I think you should have been asking Antony Blinken who was actually running the show. And it's really quite interesting. You think he had such a great geopolitical track record. I think the 13 families of the people in Afghanistan who died because of Joe Biden's botched withdrawal would certainly beg to differ with you on that. Maybe he just needed some more adrenaline, but that's an absolutely asinine take. The guy was obviously sick from day one while he was in office. And no offense, if they were going to lie about the mental health and the actual health of a president, so much so that even when he said on stage admitting to having cancer in 2022, they continued to cover it up. They called it a gaffe. The media ran cover for him. If they were willing to cover for something that huge, what else were they lying about? So I don't take Antony Blinken's word for 1 second that Joe Biden had a good sense of self when he was making decisions if he was willing to sit there as Secretary of State and say absolutely nothing for 4 years when Joe Biden was covering up truly one of the largest, I would say, health scandals, bigger than Watergate, of our time.
Okay, I'm going to stop here. If you want to watch this entire panel, they talked for almost an hour and 15 minutes on Piers Morgan's show, Piers Morgan Uncensored. They get into other topics, but this is what I wanted to focus on with this video was Cenk Uygur and Natalie Winters mainly talking about Joe Biden. And, I totally agree with Piers Morgan that it's sick for people to wish for somebody to die, even when, I absolutely think it's sick for people to find glee in this diagnosis of Joe Biden. I mean, that's just gross, as Natalie Winters said. But Piers Morgan acting surprised about this. Is this his first day on X? I don't think that it was. So, I mean, this is the internet, and this has been the internet for a long, long time. But with Natalie Winters, again, it's spin to, well, if Donald Trump were in there, this is what he would do. Instead of, again, looking at, to me, what is the most important issue is, and I agree with Cenk Uygur about the system of the Democratic Party. You know, they put their thumb on the scale to make sure that Bernie Sanders wouldn't have gotten the presidency in 2020, to make sure that Joe Biden was the nominee. And of course, Bernie Sanders was really old at that point as well. But the real conversation to me here should be about the age of the people involved and not necessarily specifically just Joe Biden. I mean, any real cover-up that needs to be checked into as well, and this corrupt system that Cenk Uygur is always talking about. I don't disagree on that. But if we just put, and you know, how this would ever come about, because the Congress isn't going to do this, because it would affect them, but we need a, you know, would it be a constitutional amendment or a law? We need a mechanism in place that we don't have these geriatric people running our country. This is something that I think the vast majority of Americans can see, and Piers Morgan doesn't bring it up, Cenk Uygur doesn't bring it up, Natalie Winters doesn't bring it up, even though I know at least Cenk Uygur, this is something that he believes in. But we need younger people in there, and the way that you do that is you have some kind of a cutoff age. But let me know what you think about all of this. Do you agree with what Cenk Uygur is saying here? Do you agree with Natalie Winters? Do you agree with Piers Morgan? Let me know in the comments your thoughts on all of this. Do we need younger presidents and younger members of Congress? Make sure to give me a like and subscribe. I'm Chris on Culture, and I will see you in the next video.